Queues can be used to manage work items such as cases, activities, and other record types. It is a place to organize and store activities and other record types that are waiting to be processed. The service module for Microsoft Dynamics 365 includes queuing and workflow tools to improve how incoming requests for sales, marketing, and customer service are handled. In this module, the objectives are to differentiate between system queues and personal queues, to evaluate how to create and maintain queues, to demonstrate how to add cases and activities to queues, to work with queue items such as routing, working on, releasing, and removing them, to define what queue item details are and what all they entail, and also to discuss how to route records to specific queues. As mentioned, queues are holding places for work items. As requests or issues are coming from customers, they expect their requests or issues to be handled in an organized, timely manner. Imagine you're waiting for a cab and there's a long line of people. If getting the next available cab became a mob activity and everyone was competing for the exact same cab, chaos would quickly ensue. Now, to better manage the line of cab riders, hotels often use a queue system where an organized line is formed, and as resources, being cabs, become available, each rider or group of riders get their cab. The same concept applies to any organization when it comes to customer issues, questions, and requests. Within the application, we can use queues to manage the routing and management of queue items, such as cases. In Microsoft Dynamics 365, all record types can be assigned to queues. They can be used to manage work items such as cases, activities, or any other record type. Now, by default, only cases and activity records are enabled for queues. In addition, cases are frequently routed to queues as part of an automated service management process. To enable queues for other record types, it is necessary to make some customizations. Within Microsoft Dynamics 365, there are 4 different types of queues available. First, there are personal queues. All Dynamics 365 users have personal queues that can be used to route important activities or records assigned to each user. Whenever each user and teams are added to Dynamics 365, by default, a personal queue is automatically configured. In addition, whenever a user is assigned to a queue item, it moves to their personal queue. Now, it's important to note, when working with personal queues, other users do not have access to see the details of those personal queues. We also have system queues. While both users and teams have default personal queues, which can be used for routing items, system queues are containers for work items that a group of people will work from a list, where users will be able to mark items they are working on. This provides administrators or support managers the ability to see not only who's working on what and what the balance of that workload is, but more importantly, what items are currently not being handled by anybody within the system. For example, you might have a queue for a certain stage of the case management process, or you could use queues for the sales process. Or perhaps you have a team that's dedicated to just lead management. You might have a queue just for leads. Next, there are shared queues. Shared queues can be created by users with the appropriate security privileges and can be used to support service management in a team-based collaborative environment. They can be made visible to all users in an organization, or can be secured so that only certain users or teams have access to the queue items. And finally, there is escalation queues. An escalation queue might be something such as a shared container for service cases that are not resolved within a specific time frame or other violations of a customer service level agreement. For example, when a service level agreements are not met, a case can be routed to a critical escalation queue to ensure the issue is addressed properly. Before we start working with queues specifically, let's talk about the process to create queues. Some of the most important tasks involved in managing Dynamics 365 queues include the following. As mentioned, the default queues for each user and team are automatically created when the user and team records are created. In addition, though, users who have sufficient security permissions can create additional queues for collaborative queue item management. A queue can have associated email aliases. System settings can be used to specify whether a queue with an email alias is approved to accept incoming email items. In other words, you might have a queue dedicated to support@companyx.com or sales@companyx.com. And then we can configure the system to have those emails automatically routed to the queue. When a queue is created automatically, it has the status of active. So in comparison to other record types found within the service modules, such as entitlements, service level agreements, or even knowledge base articles, for example, that have to be published or activated, queues, on the other hand, are activated the moment they are created. If a queue is no longer applicable to a business process, queues can also be deactivated and reactivated as necessary. They can also be deleted. However, a queue can only be deleted if there are no items within that queue, which means if it is determined that a queue needs to be removed from the system, the first step is to take all of the items that are currently in the queue and reroute them to a different queue, or as necessary, simply delete the queue items. Now keep in mind, deleting the queue items does not necessarily delete the records that are tied to them. Once that's done, then the queue can be deleted. So now that we know a little bit more about what goes into the management of a queue and the creation process, let's go into the application and see what it takes to create a queue. Queues might also be designated for cases meeting specific criteria. They can either be automatically assigned or manually assigned to certain queues. Taking a look at a couple of examples. In the first example, let's say we want all cases regarding mountain bikes to be routed to the mountain bike queue, while cases regarding road bikes are routed to the road bikes queue. Then, customer service agents with the appropriate expertise can monitor each queue. In the second example, we might want opportunity records with estimated revenue above a certain threshold to be routed to a special queue to elevate their visibility to the sales management team. Now, we'll talk more about routing cases in an upcoming lesson. Later in this module, we'll dive deeper into how to automatically route cases to queues. But for now, let's take a quick look on how to manually add a case to a queue. All right, so to be able to manually add cases to a queue, there's one of several ways to be able to do this. One of the easiest ways, if we have multiple cases that we want to have routed to a queue, we can actually do that directly within our views. So again, we actually have our views being our active cases, or maybe even my active cases. In this scenario, we're just going to start out with active cases. And let's say I actually have several of these that I want to be able to have routed to the new Tier 1 queue that I created. So from here, I can actually select the appropriate number of records that I want to be able to have routed over. So we'll just take the first couple that we have here. And then what we can do is once we actually have it selected, again, within our command bar, we actually have the button to go in and click on Add to Queue. So when I click on Add to Queue, you'll see I'm going to be prompted to ask which queue do I want to add it to. And of course, we want to add this to the new one that we just created called the Tier 1 Support. Click the Add button. Now, once I click the Add button, it actually moves that information, or moves those cases. I shouldn't say moves. It has those cases now within that queue. The reason being very specific about it does not move those cases is because when you'll now see in my active case list, these items are still here. So it doesn't necessarily move them to a queue. What it does do, though, is it actually creates what they call queue items, and we'll discuss those in a little bit. But to show you is that now what it does is if I now go to my queue, and the process of actually moving them, in the process of going through and actually having them set up and have them created within the queue, see if we can get this to load. Again, because it's working in the background, you'll see sometimes it just takes a minute to be able to actually work through that workflow process. But now, once I actually have them in the queue, you'll now see that they're available and they can be managed within that queue itself. Now, not only can we actually do that within the view, but the other option that we can have is, let's say, for example, I'm going to go down a little bit lower, and I'm actually going to go into a specific case itself. So let's say I'm working on a case, and as I realize, I've opened that case and I look at it, I'm like, you know, this actually needs to be moved or needs to be routed to another queue. So right from here, when I'm actually within the case, you'll see that I also have that option to manually have it added to a queue as well. So once I click on the Add to Queue button within my command bar, the steps are going to be exactly the same in that it's going to prompt me and ask me what queue do I want to send it to, and I in turn can send that to the same queue. All right, so when I click on Add to Queue, very much like we saw as far as within the view, I have my lookup, and again, if I know what the name of the queue is, you'll see I can actually just type it in, look it up from that particular one, click on the Add button. So what that will now do is for that particular case, again, if we go back to our queues, and we go back to our Tier 1 support queue, you'll now see that it added that particular case to that queue as well. So you'll see that you do have the ability to manually add cases to queues. And again, as we talk about in a little bit, we'll talk about ways that we can automate that process to automatically move cases to queues without having to have any kind of manual process. So as we've discussed, when cases, activities, or other records are added to a queue item record is actually created. Now again, think of it this way. A queue is not just a collection of records, it's specifically a collection of queue items. Now, a queue item serves as a container for an entity record, such as a task, email, or case that needs processing. So think of a queue item really as a go-between record between queues and the actual item. In addition, queue item views behave a little bit differently than other views within the system. When working with the different queue item views, users are provided a drop-down list allowing them to filter based upon properties of the queue items. Also, the queue drop-down list allows you to select the specific queue that you want to filter on, or even the queue items you want to be able to filter on. In addition, a queue item has a Work On field that can be used to assign the working responsibility for a queue item to a user or team. Every queue item has a Pick Action button that can be used to assign working responsibility for a queue item to a team. Now, assigning a user or a team to the Worked By field does not change the owner of the underlying record. Also, once the tasks that are required by the assignee are performed, the queue item can then be released. So when you pick an activity or a case within a queue, the case item is assigned to you. The Worked On field is also set to you if you leave the activity or the case within the queue. Should you release a queue item, in other words, you're not able to work on it, your name is then removed from the Worked By field, and the item is no longer assigned to you. Then should someone else need to work on that case or activity, the Worked By field is set to that user or team. We briefly mentioned in the last lesson about releasing a queue item. Releasing an item from the queue removes the user's name who's currently working on the record and makes that case available to be worked on by other users or teams. For example, Connie Watson will be going on vacation for 2 weeks, and she wants to either give her Coho Winery cases to someone else or release the cases so that other people on the Tier 1 support team can work on those cases. In this scenario, Connie will release the cases, which will remove her name as the person who is working on those cases. Once the cases are released, other people will be able to see the cases that are available so they can start working on them to close those cases. Queue items can also be removed from a queue at any time by a user who has sufficient security permissions. Also, be aware that when a user removes a queue item, this does not affect the record. So again, let's say Connie Watson sees a case in the queue for the Dynamics 365 questions, and after reviewing it, she realizes it's a case pertaining to another topic other than Dynamics 365. She can remove that item from the Dynamics 365 queue, and it will go back to the main system queue or be available amongst the other cases to simply be worked on and finally resolved. So now that we have a better understanding about the release process and what happens when we actually release an item from a queue, let's take a look at some elements involving managing queue items. All right, so we're actually within the Tier 1 support queue where we actually moved multiple cases that are going to be there. Now, one of the things, again, that we talked about as far as when it comes to the queue items and being able to have the different types of views. You'll notice one of the first things that you'll see is that this is where we can filter down and be able to focus on our different queues. So not only can I focus on different queues, but then from here, under my view itself, I have different options to be able to filter even further down on. So for example, right now I'm looking at all items. But on this particular one, I can also just choose items available to work on, which in this case should be all of them. Or I can go in and say, I want to just see the items just that I'm working on. So that I can now go through and be able to easily understand or have a better feeling of what is being worked on, what is not being worked on, and cases that need to be addressed. So in this situation, if we want to be able to go through and I want to say that I want to work on that particular case, again, I can actually do that right from within the view itself. I can highlight one of the records. So let's say I choose the tablet issues record. From here, the minute I select a record, like we've seen with other record types and other views, my command bar now changes. And from here, if I want to say that I now want to work on this case, I can click the Pick button from the command bar. And when I actually click on the Pick button, you'll now see that I have a dialog box confirming saying, do I want to pick it? Now, also, you'll notice that within that dialog box, it is prompting you and asking you, do you want to remove the item from the queue? Now, most of the part, you can go in and you can choose yes or you can choose no. In our situation, we're going to choose no because we want it to stay in that queue so that if I ever need to release it, I want to be able to keep it within that queue itself. So when I go in, I click on Pick. You'll now see that it still shows that the case is in the queue, but it's now showing that I'm working on that particular case. Now, if I drill down into the case, you'll see that on this particular one, I'm also the owner of the case. But the question is, what happens if I actually choose one of the cases that is not owned by me? So let's go back to our Tier 1 support queue. All right. So let's take an example as far as one that may not be necessarily owned by me. So this one, average order shipment time. So we go in and we take a look at that particular case, and you'll see that right now, the owner of that case is another user within our system. Now, same thing, let's say that I want to be able to work on that case. So again, I can go in, I can select it, click on Pick. Again, I'm going to leave it within the queue and tell it that I'm going to work on that particular case. So now you'll see that I'm actually working on both cases. Now, when I go back into that case, you'll now see that it actually changes owners. So when you pick a case, that owner of the case becomes whoever has picked it. From here, I can also, if I go back and let's say I close out of here, again, now that I'm actually working on these, let's say I want to change the view, and I can change that to items I'm working on. So now I can filter down just those records just those cases or again activities that I need to go through and I need to complete. Let's say that once I've gone through and I'm going to go in and choose items available to work on, you'll now see that again I've only got 6 of them. If I go back though, and I'm just going to choose all items so I can see all 8 of them. Let's say that, again, I'm done with this, or I need to release it back to queue for a certain reason. Again, I can actually select that particular one. I can click on Release. Once I click on Release, you'll now see that again, that worked on field has been removed, meaning that someone else now who might be monitoring that queue has the ability to go in and actually pick on it to be able to work on it as necessary. So going through and again, using the process as far as picking an actual case and how it actually changes the ownership of it. But again, it does not change the ownership of the actual case itself. It changes the ownership of the queue item. But once we go through, we can pick them, we can release them, and you'll see that that's what it will change as far as the worked by status field. All right, so not only have I been able to go through and I was able to release the case so that it's now back in this queue, but again, let's say in this particular one that we realize that this queue item really does not belong into this particular queue. So I want to be able to actually just remove the case from the queue. So if back again, I can highlight whichever case or cases that I want to be able to remove from the queue, click on the remove button, confirm that I want it removed. So now you'll see that we only have 7 cases in here, but as we mentioned before, when we remove it from that queue, it does not remove it from the system. So if I go back to service, I go back to cases, you should now see that that case is still in the active cases. In fact, it's in my active cases as well as in the total active cases. So it does not remove it from the system, it simply just removes it from the queue. As mentioned previously, when items are added to a queue, what's technically created is a queue item record. Now, the queue item details form is a form that can be customized and is designed specifically to display and manage information about that queue item. For example, perhaps priority or other details pertinent to your organization. It's important to mention, though, that queue item details does not show the detailed information from the original record, since queue items just serve as a link between that case and the queue in which it's located. In other words, from the queue item record detail, I can't see any details about the case or the activity that was routed to the queue itself. On the queue items detail record, users are allowed to set different properties pertaining to that specific queue item, some of which include who will be working the case, what's the priority, high, moderate, low. Now, most of the properties that are typically managed is who will actually be working on the case. However, when we actually come up to our next demonstration, you'll see that there are a few other fields that can also provide some level of value. And again, as we mentioned, the queue items record type is a customizable entity where you can add fields in which you want to use to be able to track the record within the queue. Now that we understand a bit more about what a queue item detail record is, let's go into the system and take a look at what the queue item detail record actually looks like and some of the underlying properties that can be of value. All right, so we're back in the system, and again, we're back in as far as our Tier 1 support queue. And just taking a look at any one of these records that are within the queue itself, and we'll just take one that I'm currently working on. So when I go in and I actually open up that queue item, from here, you'll see it looks just like any other case that we've been working on. But one of the things that's a little bit different is because it's now sitting in a queue and it's considered a queue item, up in the command bar, you'll see that you have a button there called Queue Item Details. So when I click on the Queue Item Details, this is what's now going to open up that Queue Item Details form that we just talked about. Now, as we mentioned, this is something that can be customized, so if there's additional information that we need to be able to track against that record, this is the form that we can use to customize it. At the same time, though, what you will see within this form is it simply just shows the queue where it currently resides, the name of the actual item. So if you remember in one of the other exercises where we talked about how to route it, that again, we're not taking cases, we're creating new queue items. So it gives you the name of it, who's currently working on it, if anyone is, but then more importantly, because this again where you can look at metrics and managing to making sure that cases are being handled on a timely basis, when did it enter the queue and when was the last time it was modified? So again, those are all different fields that you can use to be able to have better analytics, set up workflows to be able to automate some of these processes, or even take this form and be able to use it against service level agreements that we've talked about previously. One of the final aspects of managing items within a queue, or just getting items to a queue, is the idea of case routing. There are a couple of different ways that this can be approached. But before we show how it's done, let's talk about the concept. There are plenty of uses when it comes to routing cases, some of which may include within the service management module. The use of queues is very, very common. And cases routed to appropriate queues based on characteristics of case records, for instance, cases regarding a certain product, such as tablets, will be routed to the tablet support queue. Now, it's also possible for workflows to automatically escalate past due cases to high priority queues. This would be helpful in verifying cases do not get missed or forgotten, and which in turn enhances customer service. Now, with that said, what are some other scenarios that may be set outside of the service management area? One example might be for unassigned leads for first come, first serve assignment. Let's say that Jill entered a lot of business cards that she received from the trade show last week into Dynamics 365. She doesn't have the time to qualify or disqualify all of the leads herself. So she takes a few and leaves the rest of the leads unassigned. The remainder of the leads in the system, which are currently unassigned, are now available for other sales representatives to claim and manage going forward. Now, additionally, when it comes to case routing, case records or regular records that are enabled for the use of queues can be routed to either shared queues, system queues, or even personal queues. They don't have to be routed to the system-based queues. For example, a sales manager might route leads to a shared queue, and then inspect the queue items and select some of them to be routed to a user's personal queue. One of the key benefits of case routing is that it enables organizations to more effectively manage operational aspects of managing their customer service processes. It's also important to note that the process of routing a record from one queue to another can be done. You don't have to remove it first and then route it elsewhere. They can actually be rerouted while they're currently within an existing queue. Probably a more effective way of managing your initial cases as they enter the system is to set up case routing rules to automatically route cases. Now, these can be managed in a couple of different ways. Either a workflow could be created so that upon the creation of a case, you can have an item routed to a queue, or use the case routing rule functionality embedded within the service management area to then route cases based on various criteria when a user decides to interject the automatic case routing rules. In addition, case routing rules allows a user to automatically route cases to the right person at the right time. These could include routing cases to specific users or teams, or even route cases older than 12 hours to an escalation queue. So again, cases are often automatically routed to queues as part of an automated service management process to organize and reduce any sort of bottleneck effort. Now that we understand a bit about what's involved with case routing, let's actually see how it works. All right, so again, we're back in our Tier 1 support queue that we've been working with. Now again, in talking about as far as routing cases and being able to reroute to different people or to different queues, this is again where let's say that we actually have a specific case that we have out there. When I highlight it, from here you'll see that I can actually click on the route button, and then from here it gives me the option of whether I want to route it to a queue or route it to another user or team. So let's say in this scenario I actually want to route it to one of my other users so that they can work on this, because we've talked about it and they're like, yep, we're familiar with what's going on with this, just route it over to me. So again, I can select from an existing user that is in the system that has access to that appropriate queue, click on the route button, and you'll see that now, once I've routed it to that user, it now shows that that queue item is being worked on by that CRM demo user. Now the question is like, well, now how is that different than using the pick functionality? The difference is with the pick functionality, so again, when I highlight something, I click on pick, the only thing it does is it's going to route that or assign the work on to myself. Whereas when I use the route functionality, this now gives me the flexibility to be able to route it to another user. So from here, again, I can go in and select it and be able to have another user be able to work on that case. So that's the difference between pick and route. Pick, I assign to myself. Route, I can assign to another user. So once I've done that, let's also say that again, in looking at this information, let's say we have another priority that we actually want to send this to, or we need to escalate this. So we actually want to send this to a high priority queue that we have out there. And we have a defective item and they're pretty upset about it, so we need to make this a high priority. So what we can do is very much like we did as far as routing it to a user, we're going to use that same route button that we have in the command bar, except this time we're going to choose queue. And then from here, I can find the appropriate queue that I want to use. In this situation, we'll send it to the escalated cases queue. So now when I choose route, you'll now see that it removes it out of this queue and now basically sends it over to the escalated cases queue. Okay. Now, the other thing that we can also do is, if you remember, one of the things we talked about when it comes to automatically case routing is that we talked about this in another section where we have routing rule sets. As far as within those routing rule sets, we can set up different logic as to when we want to route a case to a specific queue based on criteria that we've specified. So in going through, you see that we actually have an existing one out here called case routing rules. And we've basically set up the logic to say we want anything where the origin is phone, we want it routed to our phone support queue. If the origin is set to email, we want it routed to our email support queue. So this goes back to, again, what we can do then is, let's say we go ahead and we create a new case. Again, I'm going to use my create feature. And on this one, we'll send this one to AdventureWorks Cycle. And then again, this time I want to make sure that I actually have it via email, because that is one of the criteria that we actually have in our case routing rules. So now, once I actually create the case, when I'm actually in that record, one of the things that I could do is if I just created the case, I have the option of not only just to save the case, but you'll also see I have the option to do what they call save and route. When I click on save and route, this is now basically saying, depending on our active routing rule sets, do you want to apply the logic behind it? So I can go ahead and click on route. And so what that will now do is automatically, if I go and I take a look at my queues, and I go to my email support, you'll now see that just by saving and routing it, it has now taken that particular case and created a queue item for my email support queue. So it helps automate that process. And again, some of this can be automated even more by the use of workflows. So case routing can be done not only as far as to a user or to a queue, or we can actually apply the case routing rules for those cases to be routed to queues automatically. In Microsoft Dynamics 365, queues can help customer service groups organize, manage, and monitor work items that are important to their customer relationship management strategies. Additionally, queues help make sure that the work items are being managed in a timely manner and routed to the correct teams. They are an integral part for a service organization to manage the flow and tracking of cases and activities to ensure consistent, accurate management of them. However, it's important to note that queues are not just applicable to the service management module. They can be used on nearly every record type within the application. In this module, the objectives were to differentiate between system queues and personal queues, to evaluate how to create and maintain queues, to demonstrate how to add cases and activities to queues, to work with queue items such as routing, working on, releasing, and removing them, to define what queue item details are and what they all entail, and finally, to discuss how to route records to specific queues. We've introduced some of the concepts and features that are available within the Service module for Microsoft Dynamics 365 to help your organization improve its customer care process and better serve your customers. To wrap up the Agent Enablement Customer Service course, let's reiterate a few things that we've learned. A key component of a customer service management strategy is just that, remarkable customer service. How are you going to fix things when they need to be fixed? How are you going to manage those requests? And what if customers have questions? Regardless of the fact of how an organization decides to answer these questions, either by doing something to manage it or by doing nothing, it impacts the experience of your customers. Each and every one of the service components can be used differently from one organization to the next. However, when used effectively, along with proper procedures, processes, and management, organizations can service their customers better and more effectively. For this course, some of the objectives include to introduce the basic record types and business processes that are involved in the customer service module, to utilize cases and queues to effectively and quickly resolve customer complaints and service issues, to examine service level agreements and how to create and manage them, and to utilize entitlement templates to create entitlements and understand entitlements related to cases, products, and service level agreements.